Thank you, Chairman and Senate Committee, for allowing me to speak in support of Senate Bills 589 and 590, and for making time to hear my story as I journey in recovery from child sexual abuse. These bills are critical to empowering victims of childhood sex abuse, not only to reclaim our lost agency, but also to put a stop to pedophiles and predators in Missouri. Research has shown that such perpetrators will not stop. They must be stopped. My name is Tammy Woods. Presently, I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan, but I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where we raised our children and where I was a victim of child sexual abuse by my pastor, Mike Bickle, when I was 14. My abuse occurred in an unincorporated county of St. Louis called South County. There is a police report on file there, though no action has been taken because of the statute of limitations. I am not alone in aging out of the pursuit of justice for child sexual abuse. Studies will show that the average age of coming forward with a story of child sexual abuse is 52 years old. I was 57 years old, 43 years after my abuse began, before I could see with clarity and begin to articulate what had happened to me. Unfortunately, for victims who were silenced for decades, when we are finally able to connect the dots and summon the courage to share our story, the legal system fails us by saying our lack of recourse is our fault. We waited too long to face the repressed trauma within. We didn't have the right frames, and we couldn't access the memories fast enough. And so silence and helplessness remain our portion, while our abusers are empowered to continue their abuse. My story of child sexual abuse began in the summer of 1980 when I had just turned 14. My family started attending Mike Bickle's church, where his sophisticated and premeditated grooming of my entire family began immediately. Mike became fast friends with my dad, created closeness with our families, and arranged for me to babysit for him and his wife every Monday night. He gave me special attention, tutoring me in the Bible. He found ways to spend time with me. He put gifts in my freshman locker at school. And once his hook was set, he began to reel me into a reality I could never have imagined. Mike told me over and over that he believed his wife was going to die and that we would be married. Unbeknownst to me, this would be a line he would use for decades as a serial predator. Before I met Mike, I had never been on a date with a boy, kissed a boy, or even held a boy's hand. As my pastor, he took my first kiss. He took my security, my relationships, my hobbies, and my very agency. He devastated me by taking my innocence at 14 years old. And he did all of this while manipulatively framing it as love and alluding to God and marriage. He told me over and over again that if we were ever caught, that I would have to own it. In other words, the burden of initiative would fall on me because he had a family and a ministry. I believed him, and I lived in a heightened state of anxiety because of this pressure. Though he moved to Kansas City when I was a junior in high school, he continued his sexual abuse during his visits and his manipulative control and spiritual abuse all throughout high school and college. An independent third-party investigation conducted by Firefly Investigations, LLC, into Mike Bickle and the ministry he founded, the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, reported in February 2025 that Mike Bickle's sexual behavior with me as a teenager, quote, escalated into sexual assault and deviant sexual intercourse as defined by current Missouri Statute 566.010, Chapter 566, and Chapter 568. The legal definitions of these crimes under Missouri law underscore the severity and criminal nature of his conduct, end quote. To simply sum up, Mike's sexual abuse and emotional control and manipulation of me was extensive. I married my husband after I graduated from college in 1988, and with that, Mike's sexual abuse stopped. But I could not see what Mike had really done, and I was duped into believing he was repentant and I was his greatest mistake. I vowed to take his secret to the grave, and I did so for 43 years as I watched his influence as a religious leader expand to an international scope. Over the years, Mike treated my family with extra attention and generosity, a seemingly supportive figure, all the while trying to do intermittent reinforcements to keep me silent. And this went on for decades. While my consciousness seemed to have made peace with the trauma I suffered, my body had not. It wasn't until December 2023 that I woke up to the nature of my childhood sexual abuse while reading Deborah's victim statement concerning her abuse by Mike Bickle. It was as if an internal detonator went off inside of me as I suddenly realized his evil abuse and deceptive control. He never stopped his predatory behavior. I wasn't the only one. With professional therapy, trauma therapy, I also came to understand that the decade-long mysterious physical symptoms of chronic pain and life-controlling claustrophobia that caused panic attacks, which had suddenly manifested later in life, were actually trauma responses to the abuse I suffered as a child. My body kept the score. In summary, 17 women have come forward as victims of Mike Bickle. 2 of us were minors. He has ridden out every statute of limitations, silencing his victims with deceptive and controlling tactics, intermittent reinforcements, bribes, and threats of lawsuits. There are 0 consequences for this dangerous and serial predator. Today, he is free to choose and abuse his next victims. The journey to awareness of sexual abuse is long. Trauma repression and memory loss are real, especially when spiritual abuse is involved. Shame and fear are paralyzing. The manipulative and deceptive frames of predators can take decades to unravel. After all, we were children. There should not and must not be a timer on this process. The statute of limitations does not consider the now well-researched and confirmed obstacles that victims of child sexual abuse must overcome. Mr. Chairman and committee members, let the Show Me State show an example how to turn the tide of justice by honoring the current research of trauma professionals and by standing with children. The child victims of Missouri, including me, ask for your help today in leveling the playing field. Allow us to do what we couldn't do as children. Fight back and pursue justice. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of Senate Bill 589 and 590, which would give the children of Missouri the legal footing needed to fight back against predators and step out of the silent shadows of victimization. My name is Deborah Perkins. Presently, I live in Raymore, Missouri. International Christian leader Mike Bickle began grooming me at the age of 12. Like Tammy Woods, I came from a loving and a beautiful family with a wonderful father, mother, and family system. However, it was no match for a sophisticated predator and renowned Christian figure. He groomed my entire family to trust him and view him as a hero, which led me to move to Kansas City to join his church. From roughly age 19 to 23, I endured a dark, secret life of sexual abuse that involved my own pastor taking my faith and twisting it and confusing it, belittling and degrading lies that held me in a prison of torment and shame. He said God had told him that his wife would die and that we would be married. He used the same lie on Tammy Woods and countless other victims. He used Bible verses to tell me that this was my destiny. He coerced me into sexual activity and varying versions of intercourse. He then made me pray and repent for it. He gave me alcohol when I was too young to drink and took advantage of me physically while I was under the influence, only to later come up with spiritual language for all that had occurred. He rented an apartment for me. He began to isolate me for his own sexual purposes and conditioned me to be more pliable for the abuse by compelling me to fast 3 days a week in order to be more radical for God, like the early Christians. He then told me he would help me sleep better by providing me wine to drink, and he gave me sleeping pills. I don't know all that happened while I was under those influences. He controlled every bit of my diet, relationships, time, and told me I was living like the early Christian monks in a radical way for God, while all of it was intended to weaken me, isolate me, and further my compliance as his sexual victim. I lived a secret horror that no one knew about while protecting him with my silence because I believed it all. I thought somehow his work for God was more important than what I was enduring. The principle of an NDA was used on me without the legal papers, in that he kept me silent for the sake of shielding his ministry and church. I felt I had no choice. He used coded language to keep holding me under his influence even after the abuse stopped. He dominated every part of my life, grooming my friends with extra attention and bonding so that they wouldn't notice all that was going on. After years of the physical abuse, I got enough out of his grip and I found the courage to move on. I met the wonderful man who is now my husband. Yet while I dated him, I had profound feelings of conflict, wondering if I was violating my faith, if God wanted to wait for my pastor God wanted me to wait for my pastor as his intended wife. I can't describe to the committee today how deeply dark these webs of entrapment truly are. This so-called Christian pastor was using cult tactics and spiritual language in his sexual abuse, which is the reason it took so long for me to unravel it all and understand the nature of what had happened. More than 20 years ago, 20 years after my abuse, I heard the story of one of Bill Cosby's victims, and I suddenly realized the nature of what I had experienced. I knew for the first time that it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. I fell to my kitchen floor and I wailed. I knew for the first time it wasn't my fault. I had been confronting the evil, controlling system that Mike Bickle created for years. But now I realize this 42-year-old predator assaulted me as an innocent 19-year-old, and none of it was my fault. I began the process of confronting him, but at the helm of his organization, he fought back, taking to his pulpit and using it to discredit and bully me. Right now, he has all the power. Because of the present laws, I and many abuse victims in Missouri have none. Mr. Chairman, committee members, without amending the laws in Missouri, nothing can be done to stop these types of predators whose abuse is sophisticated enough to require many years to disentangle. It took me over 20 years to understand that it wasn't my fault. We must give the children of Missouri as much time as they need. It is my belief that the legal provision of the statute of limitations that were intended to provide clarity of evidence actually deny child victims of sexual abuse a voice, as it often takes us too many years to gain that clarity. As someone whose life has been devastated by this harm, it seems a small kindness to ask, Mr. Chairman, committee members, please give us, the victims of Missouri, more time to find our voices. Thank you.
Thank you for making time to hear from me today. I know everyone's tired and short on time, but I ask of your ear right now. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my perspective today. My name is Gracia, and I stand before you not only as someone who has survived unspeakable abuse, but as a voice for countless others who carry the lifelong burden of childhood trauma. I am here to urge you to pass these bills, not just for my children, but for yours. After all, who among us is willing to put a price on our children's well-being? My sexual abuse began when I was 15. 2 years later, I was separately recruited into the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, led by Mike Bickle. At 18, I moved to Missouri, joined IHOP KC, and was systemically groomed, sexually assaulted, and gaslit into silence. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. Throughout my advocacy and whistleblowing journey, over 100 women have confided in me, sharing firsthand accounts of rampant sexual abuse at IHOP KC and the systemic cover-ups that it enabled. It took me years to realize I had the right to go to the police. The adults I trusted, the leadership I admired, told me I was not allowed to, and I believed them. They convinced me I was crazy and even forced me to apologize to my rapist. In the following years, while I was finding my voice and untangling their web of lies, the clock of justice kept ticking. And by the time I truly understood what was done to me, it was too late. The statute of limitations had closed just 9 months earlier. Justice slipped through my fingers before I even knew it was mine to claim. The truth is, turning 18 does not magically transform someone into an adult. Research confirms that the brain continues developing until 25, leaving young adults, especially those from abusive backgrounds, deeply vulnerable. At 18, in most ways, the law recognized me as still developing. I couldn't buy a beer. I couldn't rent a car. I couldn't serve on a jury. So why was the law not also protecting me from the very clock that was protecting my abusers? I've been sharing my story and advocating for victims of clergy sexual abuse for nearly 7 years, and most recently I found a nonprofit, the Rise and Reclaim Advocacy Group, to help these survivors attain healing resources and regain their voices. In doing so, I have cried alongside countless survivors, many of them Missouri-born women in their 50s and 60s suffering from complex PTSD. They grieve not just their stolen childhoods, but their rights to justice. The truth is, the pain of trauma has no expiration date. Why does accountability? Predators must learn that the law will no longer be their shield. With your help, it can be their reckoning. With this bill, we do more than update the law. We rewrite the narrative. We declare loud and clear, Missouri chooses to stand with survivors, to believe them, to empower them, and to signal that they are owed healing more than their abusers are owed immunity for their crimes. So I ask on you, please reflect on the children in your lives, your own sons and daughters, nieces and nephews. Imagine the unthinkable happening to them and the barriers they might face in seeking justice. Will you stand, not only with me and my children, but with yours? Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, for the opportunity to speak before you today in support of SB 589 and 590. My name is Keith Eigert, and I'm a resident of Branson, Missouri, and I have been for over 30 years now. I grew up across the lake from Kanakuk and Branson, the prominent Christian sports camp that's based in my hometown where I still live today. Every summer when I was a kid, all summer long, I could hear the cheers and excitement from Kanakuk echo right across the water into my backyard. Several kids from school went there every year, but it was always a little out of reach financially for my family for me to go myself. However, in 7th grade, I met one of the camp's directors at a local non-denominational youth group, which ended up actually becoming Kanakuk's parachurch ministry called K-Life. This director, named Pete Newman, quickly befriended me and gained my trust, and unbeknownst to me, was starting to groom me. He frequently took me to Kanakuk facilities and events, and it didn't cost a penny. It was a dream come true for me, except for the brainwashing that I was oblivious to, and then the consequential sexual abuse. Long story short, this went on for the rest of my adolescence. And then, one day, without really any warning, Pete basically went MIA. And then a little after that, news articles and coverage started coming out accusing him of grooming children and taking advantage of them. I was stunned and I was severely confused, as I couldn't even make sense of what I was hearing. I had loved, trusted, and respected Pete, so none of these accusations could even fit in my paradigm. Fast forward through months of counseling and only beginning to understand that I was actually a victim, I also inadvertently learned that Joe White, the CEO and owner of Kanakuk Camps to this day, along with other camp leadership, had caught Pete Newman engaging in naked and felonious acts with underage boys. This happened no less than on 3 separate occasions, and at least one of those occasions happened before I even personally met Pete. So just to reemphasize, Kanakuk had caught Pete naked with boys on 3 separate occasions. One of them, at least, happened before I even met Pete. Kanakuk was aware of this. Their leadership was aware of this. The public was not. They did not mandatory report this as they should have. Fast forward several more years, and now I was in a mediation room for a lawsuit against Kanakuk. There are lots of details, but for the sake of time, my honest and true belief, my testimony, is that I had no other option other than to settle with Kanakuk. And that settlement, the only way we could settle, was with the cost of signing an NDA. And that NDA has been a constant warning to myself about how much of my own story I can or cannot tell. My friends in the Alarcon family, they went through a similar lawsuit against Kanakuk, but they absolutely refused to sign an NDA. Kanakuk then sent their lawyers after them for refusing to sign. And then this already traumatized and tired family had to shell out $40,000 simply to defend themselves against a baseless claim. There's another friend of mine who didn't really start getting help processing his trauma until a little later in life. And as you'd have it, the sweet sickness of Kanakuk used its affiliation with my friend's therapist to conveniently dissuade my abused friend from ever considering justice through the legal system against Kanakuk for harboring pedophiles and hiding their abuse. This lasted long enough for this victim to age out of being able to pursue legal justice against Kanakuk. I was exhausted from a years-long legal pursuit. I was hesitant to share my story with my unavoidable NDA. The Alarcons were attacked for refusing to sign away their right to speak. And one of my best friends I grew up with couldn't even seek legal repercussions against the institution that empowered our common childhood sexual abuser. Please tell me which of these scenarios is an example of NDAs or statute of limitations working to protect our children and the public safety. The answer is none of them, and it's actually just the opposite. Kanakuk, who has harbored, protected, and empowered pedophiles and covered up the abuse, has only benefited from truth silencing NDAs and the statute of limitations that prevents more victims from calling to account Kanakuk's crimes. Common sense is a buzzword these days, but making the improvements imposed by SB 589 and 590 has to be just that, common sense. Thank you for letting me share some of my story with you today, and I urge you, I beg you, to see these bills through to law. It's the right thing to do, it's the good thing to do, it is the just thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Schroer and committee members, for welcoming this army of survivors and advocates today. This is a historic hearing and so needed. I'm Elizabeth Phillips from Dallas, Texas, and a very reluctant expert on both of these bills. A special thank you to Senator Hudson for authoring SB 590 to prohibit the misuse of NDAs against child sexual abuse and trafficking victims. Thank you also for naming it Trey's Law, after my late brother, Trey Carlock. He was silenced to his grave by Kanakuk Ministries based in Taney County, the greater Branson area. The action you're taking here honors Trey and the countless survivors of child sexual abuse like him who didn't survive. I am also here to testify in favor of SB 589, which would eliminate Missouri Civil Statute of Limitations for child sexual abuse cases against institutions like Kanakuk, a statute this state has not modified since 1939. Trey's story speaks to both bills. They are intertwined, as my testimony and others here today will explain. My brother Trey endured a decade of grooming and sexual abuse by popular Kanakuk director Pete Newman. He's now in prison here in Jefferson City for 2 life terms plus 30 years. This was followed by a re-traumatizing civil litigation process that ended with a restrictive NDA. Then, in 2019, Trey's tragic suicide. Now that I've caught my breath, I'm trying to be his voice. Having a front row seat to my brother's suffering and death, I often say that Trey's journey of injustice had many layers and multiple perpetrators. First and foremost, I blame serial sex offender Pete Newman, with 57 known victims at the time of his sentencing in 2010, and estimates that his true victim count is in the hundreds or even thousands. Next, we have to look at Kanakuk, the institution. Since launching factsaboutkanakuk.com in 2021, our survivor community has received hundreds of tips with allegations against more than 65 unique perpetrators associated with Kanakuk, with claims dating from 1958 to today. Joe White, who bought the camp from his parents in the 1970s and runs it to this day, promoted directors like Pete Newman, despite known sexual misconduct with children. Kanakuk must be held accountable for not implementing proper policies, for not firing Pete Newman after parents raised repeated red flags, for failure to consistently report his patterns of nudity with children to the authorities, and for lying to victims and everyone for decades. Instead, they are about to celebrate their centennial summer as they double down on their cover-up to preserve brand reputation. What helps them do that? NDAs. I have actually learned more about the extent of my brother's abuse and his death than I knew in his life due to the NDA Kanakuk put him under. Trey told a therapist, They will always control me, and I'll never be free, before he died by suicide at the age of 28. He called his settlement dollars blood money because taking that money in exchange for an NDA felt like a bribe. He needed those dollars for a lifetime of care, but it came at the cost of his voice and freedom. Trey hesitated even to tell his story in confidential settings like AA, for fear that Kanakuk would come after him again like they did by federally sanctioning an earlier John Doe. In 2021, survivors and their families coalesced around a petition asking Kanakuk to release victims from their NDAs, which quickly garnered around 30,000 signatures. Kanakuk's response? First, they declared they don't use NDAs. Then they admitted they do use NDAs, but only at the request of the plaintiffs. Another lie. Now they say they do use NDAs and they support survivors coming forward. However, their insurance companies may come after you if you disclose settlement terms. So we're not going to give Kanakuk any more chances to do the right thing. We're going to have to change the law. A lot of truth dies with people because of NDAs, and like a short statute of limitations on childhood sex crimes that only protects bad actors, which is contrary to public interest. To me, that is the point of Trey's law and this hearing today: public safety, protecting children. My brother was forced by the state to file his civil lawsuit against Kanakuk before he was ready, in his early 20s. And opposing counsel's gaslighting and depositions eventually led him to a psychotic break. It's no exaggeration for me to claim that these issues are a matter of life and death. When you've survived a childhood crime, you should have the freedom to decide if and when you want to seek justice through the civil courts. Victims should have full control of their own narratives and the pace of their healing journey. Not an NDA, and not a law in Missouri from the Prohibition era. For context, over 33 U.S. states and territories, including your neighbor Arkansas, have passed revival legislation for civil child sexual abuse cases because the argument is simple. Let victims of childhood crimes have access to civil courts, and then your civil courts will uncover hidden predators and the institutions that harbor them. The criminal justice system has its limits, but civil action can also lead to criminal accountability, which is what I think people who harm kids should face. Survivors have flown in from all over the country to testify, and you'll notice a pattern. The majority of child sexual abuse and trafficking victims do not disclose their abuse until much later in life. As Senator Hudson mentioned, it takes an average of 20 years for victims of child sexual abuse to come forward for the first time, if they ever do at all. You'll also learn that Missouri's draconian statute of limitations for both institutions and individual perpetrators is behind the rest of the country. Basically, if you're going to get raped in America, don't do it in Missouri. Your antiquated laws here attract child predators and organizations that have something to hide. We're ringing the alarm. It's also confusing to victims that you can sue your perpetrator up until the age of 31, but the institution responsible for your abuse and covering it up is only liable until you turn 26. This inconsistency in Missouri statute does not track with other states, and my guess is that the institutional component of the current statute has been driven by insurance and other lobbying groups more concerned about losing money than protecting life. I have a statement we can share with the committee by the largest insurer of YMCAs in the country, Redwood's Insurance Group, which stands with child sexual abuse survivors to pass bills like SB 589 all over the country. This call to action is also available on their website, along with an invitation for fellow insurers to join the good side of this fight. Redwoods even offers consulting services to peer companies that are confused about this problem and its solutions. The two bills Senator Hudson is presenting you today address gaps in Missouri's law that fail kids, and therefore all of us. Only you, as lawmakers, can prevent a story like Trey's, whether for Missourian kids or for those that come here for tourism, school, or recreation. There are Kanakuk victims from Hawaii to Haiti, New York to China, and all over the U.S. Yet this is my third session testifying before the Missouri legislature without anything passing the Senate or General Assembly. This is the first time a Senate committee has given these bills and the voices behind them the attention they deserve. So I'm here again to ask you to please remember Trey. I'm asking this legislature to pass Trey's law as an urgent matter of public safety and to give victims their voices back. And I'm also humbly pleading with you to not stop there. Please address the civil statute of limitations in Missouri for these survivors, so future victims aren't put on a clock they never even knew was ticking. Senate Bills 589 and 590, along with SJR 51, must pass this session to make progress on child protection and repair past injustices. Thank you, and with that, I'm prepared to take questions.